Cale, a 45-year-old artist, had spent the majority of his life immersed in the world of art. His creations were intricate, carefully crafted, and always thought-provoking. Art wasn't just his passion, it was his life. His best friend Lucas had been there every step of the way. They shared countless experiences, critiques, and dreams. To Cale, Lucas wasn't just a fellow artist, he was a brother. The trust they had built over the years was unshakable, or so Cale thought. One afternoon, while attending an exhibition, Kyle stumbled upon a piece of artwork that stopped him in his tracks. It wasn't just any piece, it was one of his own. Kyle's mind raced, his heart pounded in his chest. Lucas, his best friend, had been showcasing Cale's work as his own. The shock hit him hard. It wasn't just the theft of his art, it was the betrayal by the one person who he thought understood him more than anyone else. Cale's world began to unravel. The weight of the betrayal crushed him. How could Lucas, the person he had trusted the most, do something like this? The anger swirled inside him. But it wasn't just anger, it was a deep sense of loss. Cale wasn't just mourning the theft of his art, he was mourning the loss of a friendship, the very foundation of his trust. In that moment, Cale knew he had to do something. This wasn't just about art anymore. It was about exposing the truth. Cale knew that seeking revenge would not be as simple as confronting Lucas or resorting to violence. No, Cale was a man of intellect, a thinker, and he wanted his revenge to reflect that. He decided his approach would be different. It wouldn't be a petty act of anger, but a calculated psychological play that would expose Lucas for who he truly was. Cale was going to make Lucas unravel in front of the very community that had once praised him. As Cale sat in his studio, the silence around him was deafening. The weight of the betrayal lingered, but it was also the spark that ignited his creative fire. He began to plan his next move. The art world was a complex network of admiration, technical knowledge, and prestige. Lucas had taken advantage of this, pretending to be the creator of Cale's masterpieces. But Cale was ready to turn the tables. He knew the art world was built not just on the work itself, but on understanding the nuances and stories behind it. It wasn't enough to just display a piece of art. You had to know it, and Cale would use that knowledge against Lucas. Each day, Cale studied his own works in detail, reminding himself of the techniques, the symbolism, and the philosophical depth embedded in every brushstroke. He knew Lucas wouldn't be able to answer the questions Cale was planning to ask, and that, he believed, would be his ultimate victory. Cale's motivation wasn't just to expose Lucas, it was to prove that art wasn't just about stealing, it was about understanding, creating, and respecting the journey behind each piece. The plan was set in motion. Cale began to attend art events, quietly gathering information on the upcoming exhibitions where Lucas would showcase his new collection. Every night, Kyle would study his own art in greater depth, revisiting each piece as if it were a memory he had to relive. The brush strokes, the color choices, the philosophical undertones, all of it had been part of his soul, and Kyle knew every detail inside out. It was the perfect weapon for his intellectual battle, but the emotional toll was harder to bear than he had anticipated. Cale would sit at his canvas, staring at the empty space, feeling the hollow ache of betrayal deep within his chest. The anger was there, yes, but it was tempered by a profound sadness. Lucas wasn't just a friend, he was a confidant, a part of Cale's life for so long. Now, the trust they had built was gone, and Cale had no choice but to face the truth. Sometimes the people closest to you can be the ones who hurt you the most. Still, Cale pressed on. The next exhibition was just around the corner, and Cale had a feeling that this confrontation would change everything. His goal wasn't just to expose Lucas for the fraud he was, it was to teach him a lesson. Art wasn't just about who could sell more or who could be more popular. It was about integrity, and Cale was about to show Lucas just how important that integrity truly was. Cale had spent the last few weeks quietly gathering information. He had researched Lucas's new collection thoroughly, analyzing every detail, from the brushwork to the subtle thematic elements that only a true artist would notice. Cale's knowledge was vast, and his plan was taking shape, but he knew that this would not be an easy fight. The art world, with its pomp and prestige, was a beast of its own, and Lucas had been a skilled player within it. He had already built a reputation on Cale's stolen works, and tearing it down would require more than just technical questions. Cale had to get inside Lucas's mind. Cale began attending art shows, pretending to be just another patron, while silently tracking the locations of Lucas's exhibitions. He would show up at the openings, engage in casual conversation, and observe the subtle interactions of the art world. He wasn't just a visitor. He was a silent observer, making mental notes on how people reacted to the pieces Lucas claimed as his own. It was all part of the strategy. He had to know not only the art, but the environment in which it was displayed. At night, Cale would return to his studio, sometimes exhausted, but always energized by the purpose that drove him. His thoughts began to blend with the art itself. Each brushstroke on his canvas felt like an act of defiance. He was no longer just creating, he was preparing for war. His mind raced, replaying conversations and observations, formulating the perfect strategy. He had to make sure that when the time came, every word, every question, and every action would serve as a reminder to Lucas that his deception was not only obvious to Cale, but soon to be revealed to the world. The closer Cale got to the exhibition, the more the anticipation gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that, despite all his preparation, something might go wrong. He couldn't afford any missteps. This was his chance to expose Lucas in front of the entire art world. It wasn't just about reclaiming his art. It was about restoring his pride. Yet, as much as Cale tried to focus on the technical details, the emotions lingered. The betrayal had left a scar, one that no amount of intellectual victory could erase, but Cale pushed those feelings aside. The plan was more important than anything else now. As the day of the exhibition approached, Cale's preparations intensified. He began to hone in on specific technical aspects of his works that Lucas couldn't possibly replicate. The brushstrokes, the historical references, even the subtle philosophical meanings that underpinned each piece. Cale had put years into perfecting them, and Lucas could never have understood them in the way Cale did. Cale wasn't just preparing for a confrontation. He was preparing for an intellectual duel that would strip Lucas of the very thing he had stolen, the essence of Cale's art. The day of the exhibition finally arrived. Cale arrived early, slipping into the crowd of well-dressed patrons. He made his way through the gallery, eyes scanning each piece, looking for the familiar strokes and colors that Lucas had claimed as his own. When he found them, his heart skipped a beat. Not out of anger, but of determination. He was ready. With every step, he could feel the tension build. This wasn't just about confronting Lucas. This was about exposing a lie that had been allowed to fester for far too long, and Cale was ready to make it known. As Cale approached Lucas, who was mingling with the crowd near one of the pieces, his heart raced, not from fear but from the exhilarating sense of control. This was his moment. His eyes locked onto Lucas, who, as usual, wore a confident smile, the same smile that Cale had once trusted. But today, it was different. Cale had already seen through the illusion. Now, all that remained was for the world to see it too. Cale waited for the perfect moment to strike. He started by casually admiring one of the pieces Lucas had created. Then, in a voice that could only be described as calm and collected, Cale asked, "Lucas, tell me, what inspired you to use such an unusual blend of textures on this one?" The question was simple, but it was enough to rattle Lucas. Cale knew the answer. He had painted it after all. But Lucas, caught off guard, hesitated. Cale noticed his discomfort, the slight pause before he responded, and it was in that moment that Cale realized this wasn't just about exposing Lucas. It was about watching him squirm under the weight of his own deceit. The questions came more rapidly after that, each one more specific and technical than the last. Cale inquired about the symbolism behind a particular color choice, the inspiration for a subtle brushstroke that only a true artist would recognize. With each question, Lucas grew more flustered, his answers becoming less and less coherent. The once confident man was now stumbling over his words, trying to mask his insecurity with forced laughter and vague responses. Cale could see the cracks forming in Lucas's facade, and it was exhilarating. By now, a few patrons were watching the interaction, exchanging curious glances. Cale let the tension build, not rushing to expose the truth immediately. He wanted Lucas to unravel, to realize that his lies weren't just affecting Cale, they were on the verge of being exposed for everyone to see. The audience, unknowingly, was beginning to witness the beginning of Lucas's downfall. As the exchange continued, the tension in the air grew palpable. Cale felt a sense of power that he hadn't anticipated. It was no longer about the art. It was about the satisfaction of watching Lucas squirm under the pressure. Cale's questions became more intricate, more probing. He asked about the specific brushwork on a painting that Lucas had passed off as his own, one that Cale had painstakingly worked on years ago. The more Cale pushed, the more Lucas faltered, his eyes darting around, trying to find an escape from the inevitable confrontation. The small crowd that had gathered around them began to murmur, their curiosity piqued. Cale, without a hint of hesitation, continued his methodical questioning, each word deliberate and precise. The discomfort on Lucas's face was undeniable now. His answers, once smooth and practiced, became fragmented and disjointed. He stumbled over technical details he should have known inside and out if he were truly the artist. Cale could see the realization begin to dawn on the onlookers. Lucas's facade of confidence was slipping, and Cale's heart raced, not out of triumph, but from the deep sense of justice that now filled him. At that moment, Cale decided it was time to reveal the truth. In a calm, almost casual tone, he turned to the crowd and said, "You all should know that this piece," Cale gestured toward the painting Lucas had claimed as his own, "was created by me. The techniques Lucas here is struggling to explain are mine. The brush strokes, the meaning behind each layer, it's all my work." The room fell silent. The shift in the atmosphere was immediate. Lucas's face drained of color. He opened his mouth, trying to form a response, but nothing came out. The art world, the very world that had once adored him, was now turning its gaze toward him in judgment. Cale's heart pounded, not with revenge, but with the clarity that his plan was unfolding exactly as he had envisioned. Lucas had been exposed for what he truly was, a thief, a liar, and Cale had just served justice in the most cerebral way possible. The aftermath of Cale's revelation was immediate and overwhelming. Whispers filled the room, and eyes darted from Lucas to Cale and back again. The crowd, once charmed by Lucas's charm and reputation, now looked at him with suspicion and doubt. Lucas, visibly shaken, tried to maintain his composure, but it was clear that the once unshakable confidence was now gone. Cale had done what he set out to do, but the satisfaction of seeing Lucas exposed was not as sweet as he had imagined. In fact, as the room's atmosphere shifted, Cale felt an unexpected weight settle on his chest. Cale stood still, observing the unfolding chaos. The patrons around him whispered to one another, some with disbelief, others with curiosity. They had never seen an artist laid bare like this, exposed for the fraud he was. But even with the truth now out in the open, there was a strange emptiness in Cale. The art world that had once been a place of inspiration and mutual respect now felt cold and unwelcoming. It was as though the very thing that had once brought Cale joy, his art, had been tainted by this confrontation. Lucas, struggling to find his words, finally spoke, his voice quivering with a mix of anger and humiliation. "This is a lie! I've worked hard for everything I have." His eyes, once filled with ambition, were now clouded with desperation. But Cale, calm as ever, met his gaze without a flicker of emotion. The truth was out, and there was nothing Lucas could say that would change that. This was no longer about his work or his career. It was about something much deeper. It was about the betrayal that had cut Cale to the bone, and how, in that moment, Cale had reclaimed his dignity. As the confrontation continued, Cale felt a shift within himself. He had set out to expose Lucas, to take back what was rightfully his. But what he hadn't anticipated was the emotional toll it would take on him. He was no longer just an artist. He was someone who had been wronged, and the lines between justice and vengeance had blurred. Cale couldn't help but wonder, had this been worth it? In his quest for justice, he had exposed not just Lucas, but himself as well. His art, his passion, had been caught in the crossfire of their broken friendship. The tension in the room was thick, like the air before a storm. Cale could hear Lucas's voice shaking as he tried to regain control, but it was too late. The damage had been done. People who had once lauded Lucas for his brilliance were now questioning his integrity. Cale, however, didn't feel the triumph he thought he would. The satisfaction of exposing the truth was buried beneath an overwhelming sense of emptiness. He had done what he came to do, but now he was faced with the reality that revenge, no matter how intellectual or justified, did not offer the peace he had hoped for. As Lucas floundered, Cale watched him crumble. His friend, or rather the man Cale had once called his closest ally, was now just another face in the crowd, lost and humiliated. There was no glory in this moment, no joy in seeing Lucas suffer. Cale had always believed that exposing the truth would bring closure, but instead, he felt a deep sorrow. This wasn't the victory he had envisioned. It was the unraveling of everything he had once held dear. For a moment, Cale felt as though the entire room was watching him, waiting for him to speak, to explain why he had done this, but he couldn't. What was there to say? He had been betrayed by someone he had trusted, and now, in his pursuit of justice, he had shattered not only Lucas's reputation, but also a part of himself. Cale's gaze shifted from Lucas to the artwork on the walls. His works, once full of passion and purpose, now seemed distant, as though they no longer belonged to him. They were the remnants of a past that had been torn apart by betrayal. Despite the confusion and turmoil, Kyle felt a shift within himself. He had confronted Lucas, and in doing so, had confronted his own demons. The anger and the hurt that had once consumed him now seemed less important. As the gallery began to clear, and Lucas's disgrace became apparent to all, Cale realized that this was no longer about revenge. It had never truly been about that. It was about reclaiming himself, his truth, and his art, without relying on anyone else to validate it. As the crowd slowly dissipated, Cale stood alone in the gallery, surrounded by the works that had once been his pride and joy, the art that had brought him recognition, acclaim, and ultimately betrayal, now seemed like ghosts in the room. The silence was deafening, the kind of silence that follows a storm when everything is left in its wake. Kyle had not only exposed Lucas, but had also shattered the illusion of the perfect art world he had once believed in. Nothing felt quite the same. Cale's mind raced as he tried to process what had just transpired. He had done what he set out to do. Lucas had been exposed. The truth had been revealed, and the art world could no longer ignore the deception. But as Cale stood there, he realized that this victory was not the closure he had imagined. In fact, it left him with more questions than answers. What now? What did it mean for his future as an artist? Was he forever bound to the memory of the betrayal, or could he rise above it? Lucas, still humiliated and unsure of what to do next, avoided eye contact with Cale. There was nothing left to say. The relationship between them was beyond repair. But Cale didn't feel vindicated. Instead, he felt a deep sorrow for the friendship that had been lost, the trust that had been shattered beyond repair. It was as if he had lost a part of himself in the process. As the last few patrons filtered out of the gallery, Cale made his way to the door. He didn't look back at Lucas. He didn't need to. He had gotten his justice. But in the end, Cale realized that justice, no matter how deserved, couldn't bring back the pieces of his life that had been broken along the way. The fallout from the exhibition was swift. The art world, once enamored by Lucas's talent, was now in turmoil. Cale had set the wheels of exposure in motion, and the truth spread quickly. Lucas's once pristine reputation began to crumble, and soon enough, galleries that had previously showcased his work began distancing themselves. The artists who had once supported him pulled away, some privately, others publicly, and Lucas found himself alone. His lies had caught up with him in the most public of ways, but as the art world turned its back on Lucas, Cale was left with a complex mix of emotions. There was no joy in watching his former best friend spiral into disgrace. No matter how just it seemed, Cale couldn't help but feel a hollow emptiness. Exposing Lucas had been about righting a wrong, but it had also forced Cale to confront something far deeper within himself. He had built his life around his art, around the belief that his work was his own. But now, standing in the aftermath, Cale felt detached from it all. Despite the sense of vindication that should have accompanied the victory, Cale couldn't ignore the emotional toll it had taken. He was no longer sure of what he had truly gained. He had exposed Lucas's betrayal. Yes, but had he really won? There was a sense of finality to the whole ordeal, but it wasn't the kind of conclusion Cale had hoped for. He wasn't the hero in a story of redemption and justice. He was simply someone who had done what was necessary. No more, no less. As Cale reflected on everything that had happened, he began to question the very nature of revenge. What had it accomplished? Had it truly restored the balance that had been upset, or had it left him with scars that no amount of intellectual victory could heal? The world might know the truth now, but Cale knew that this was only the beginning of a much more profound reckoning, one that he would have to face, alone, with the weight of his choices. As the days passed, the dust began to settle, but Cale's thoughts remained turbulent. The art world had moved on, as it always did, quickly embracing new trends and fresh talent, leaving Lucas behind in the wreckage of his own making. But Cale couldn't shake the haunting question, was this really what I wanted? The aftermath, rather than bringing him peace, only seemed to deepen the uncertainty that had been lurking beneath the surface. Cale found himself returning to his studio more often, but it was different now. The walls that had once felt like his sanctuary now seemed suffocating. His brushes and canvases, tools of expression and healing, now felt like burdens, reminders of a past that had been irrevocably altered. The act of painting, once a source of joy and release, now felt like a duty, a responsibility to create in a world where everything had been tainted by betrayal. Cale had long believed that his art defined him, but now he wondered, was I more than just the sum of my work? Late one evening, as Cale stood before a blank canvas, he found himself grappling with the enormity of his decision. His revenge had been cold, calculated and precise. It had been a victory, yes, but it had come at a cost. The emotional toll of exposing Lucas, of watching the man he once considered a brother unravel in front of the world, had weighed heavily on him. He realized now that in seeking to reclaim what was his, he had lost more than he had ever anticipated. The art that had once filled him with passion now seemed distant, almost foreign. And in that distance, Cale saw something he hadn't before. The part of him that had always needed validation, always needed to prove his worth, even if it meant destroying a friendship. The idea of moving forward began to take root in Cale's mind. He couldn't change what had happened. The betrayal and the subsequent exposure were in the past. But what about the future? Was it possible for him to heal? To find a way back to the art that had once been his true voice? Cale didn't have the answers, but for the first time, he felt ready to search for them. This chapter of his life had ended, but the next one was still waiting to be written. In the quiet of his studio, Cale began to understand the depth of his own internal transformation. His journey, once driven by the desire for revenge, was now shifting towards something more introspective. It was as if a veil had been lifted from his eyes. He had seen Lucas exposed for the fraud he was, but in the process, Cale had also seen himself in a new light. The truth of his own pain, the wound of betrayal, had become clearer, but so had the realization that healing could only begin once he stopped looking back. Cale had been consumed by anger, by the need to reclaim what was his, but now that the battle was over, the silence felt overwhelming. He could no longer be the person who was defined by his past, by his friendship with Lucas, by the art that had been stolen from him. Cale had to redefine himself. His worth was never in the validation of others or in the recognition of his art. His worth had always been intrinsic, tied to his own understanding of who he was. And as the days stretched on, Cale slowly began to come to terms with that. One evening, as Cale stood before his canvas, the brush in his hand felt different. It was no longer just a tool for creating masterpieces that would be admired. It was a way for him to express what had been buried deep inside. For the first time since the betrayal, Cale painted not with the intention to prove something to the world, but simply to express himself, to release the emotions he had kept locked away. It was liberating in a way he hadn't expected. The more he painted, the more he felt like himself again. The art wasn't about revenge or recognition anymore. It was about healing, about moving forward. As the final strokes were added to the canvas, Cale stepped back and admired his work. The piece was different from anything he had done before. It was raw, unrefined, and yet it held a beauty that felt honest and true. Cale realized with a quiet sense of peace that he didn't need anyone's approval. His art, his journey, and his self-worth were his alone to define. And in that moment, he understood. True freedom came from within. In the weeks following the fallout, Cale found himself slipping into a new rhythm. The world had moved on, and so had he. The art galleries had moved on to new exhibits, and the whispers about Lucas's downfall had died down. Cale, however, was left with something more profound, a quiet sense of introspection that had followed him through the aftermath. He had gotten what he wanted, Lucas was exposed, but now, as time passed, Cale wondered if he truly felt the victory he had expected. What had he really gained from this? The question lingered in his mind, unanswered, as he continued to move through the motions of life. In the solitude of his studio, Cale began to think about the true cost of his actions. Yes, he had exposed Lucas, but what had it done for him? The confrontation had felt necessary, but Cale realized that, in his pursuit of justice, he had also sacrificed a piece of his own soul. He had let anger guide him, and although the intellectual victory was satisfying, the emotional void it had left behind was still there, haunting him. The betrayal by Lucas had once consumed him, but now Cale found that his own need for revenge had only deepened the wound. And yet, as he continued to create, Cale began to realize something unexpected. He was changing. His art was changing. There was a rawness to it now, a vulnerability that had never been there before. He could feel it in every brushstroke. His paintings were no longer just about technical perfection or achieving recognition. They were about something deeper, something personal. His art had become an extension of his healing process. The very act of creating had become a way to reclaim what had been lost. Not just his art, but his sense of self. As the days passed, Cale found peace in the act of creation, but there was still an underlying melancholy that lingered. His work had become more honest, more vulnerable, yet something inside him felt incomplete. He had avenged the betrayal, but the satisfaction of seeing Lucas's downfall had not brought the relief he had expected. Instead, it had left him questioning whether revenge, even when deserved, truly offered the peace he sought. Cale's focus shifted. The art, the passion, and the self-doubt that had once plagued him now felt like stepping stones toward a new understanding of himself. Cale spent more time away from the gallery scene, retreating into the quieter spaces where his art could breathe without the weight of an audience's gaze. He found solace in the unspoken, painting late into the night, exploring new techniques, and reconnecting with the essence of his craft. The public had moved on, but for Cale, this was just the beginning of a new chapter. His work had always been about communication, but now it was about healing, both for him and for those who would see it. The pain and betrayal had shaped him, but they did not define him. Cale understood now that his art wasn't just a means of validation, it was his personal journey, his truth expressed in color and form. Despite his internal growth, Cale couldn't deny the quiet sorrow that still lingered. He had once viewed his work as a legacy to be admired, but now it had taken on a more fragile, almost fragile meaning. He wasn't creating for the accolades anymore. He was creating to survive, to navigate the complexities of a world that had, in its own way, taken something from him. And in this new chapter, Cale realized that he didn't need revenge to find closure. The act of creating, of rebuilding from the rubble, was enough. In the quiet of his studio, Cale stood before his latest canvas. The brush in his hand felt like a part of him, fluid and natural, as if the pain, the betrayal, and the lessons learned had all been absorbed into his work. He had moved on from the anger, the desire for revenge, and had transformed those emotions into something pure, art. He was no longer just creating for the sake of proving himself or seeking justice. Now, he painted to give voice to the emotions that had once been locked away, to let his soul speak without fear of judgment. As Cale stepped back from the canvas, he took a deep breath. There was still a lingering emptiness within him, but it wasn't the hollow feeling of betrayal anymore. It was the kind of emptiness that comes from growth, the space between who he had been and who he was becoming. He wasn't the same man who had sought revenge, and he wasn't the same artist who had believed his worth was tied to others' approval. He had let go of the past, not by erasing it, but by accepting it as a part of his journey. Cale realized that, in the end, the best form of justice wasn't in exposing Lucas or taking back what was his. It was in the quiet moments of self-reflection, in the brushstrokes that spoke louder than words, and in the acceptance that some things, like betrayal, would always remain a part of him. But instead of letting those scars define him, Cale had transformed them into something beautiful. His art would forever bear the mark of his past, but it would also be a testament to his ability to rise above it. And that, Cale realized, was his true legacy.